One of the most emotionally draining experiences in relationships is loving someone who treats you like an option instead of a priority. You give your attention, your loyalty, your patience, and your emotional energy consistently while they give you uncertainty. One day they act interested. The next day they become distant. Sometimes they make you feel important, and other times they disappear emotionally, as if your feelings are secondary to whatever else is happening in their life. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin chasing clarity from someone who keeps creating confusion. You overthink their behavior constantly. You wait for replies. You search for hidden meaning in small actions. You keep hoping their inconsistency will eventually become commitment. But the truth is, when someone truly values you deeply, they do not constantly make you question where you stand emotionally. Real interest creates effort. Real care creates consistency. Real emotional maturity does not keep someone trapped in endless uncertainty while still expecting access to their love and attention. This is why chasing someone who repeatedly treats you like an option becomes dangerous emotionally. Because every time you ignore your own pain to maintain access to them, you slowly teach yourself that your self-respect is negotiable. You begin accepting crumbs emotionally because you are afraid of losing the connection completely. And the more you chase someone for validation, the more emotionally dependent you become on their unpredictable attention. That emotional dependence creates imbalance. Now they control the emotional dynamic. Your mood rises and falls based on their behavior. Your peace depends on whether they choose you consistently or temporarily. And instead of feeling emotionally secure, you begin living in survival mode inside the relationship. But something powerful happens the moment you stop chasing. Not because you stopped caring completely, but because you finally recognize that your dignity matters too. You realize that constantly proving your worth to someone who keeps placing you in emotional competition is exhausting. You understand that healthy love should not require endless begging for consistency, clarity, or basic emotional respect. And once that realization becomes real internally, your focus begins changing. Instead of trying to secure their attention constantly, you begin protecting your own peace. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop forcing conversations that go nowhere. You stop trying to convince someone to value what they should naturally recognize. And this shift changes your energy immediately, because chasing communicates fear. Fear of losing them. Fear of not being enough. Fear that your happiness depends on their choice. But self-respect communicates emotional strength. It says, I may care deeply, but I will not abandon myself emotionally just to keep someone who refuses to value me consistently. That energy feels completely different. Now your emotional world no longer revolves entirely around their unpredictability. You begin reconnecting with yourself again, your routines, your goals, your emotional stability. Your confidence slowly rebuilds because your self-worth stops depending on someone else's inconsistent attention. And ironically, this is often when the emotional dynamic changes too, because people frequently take emotional access for granted when it feels guaranteed. As long as they believe you will always remain available, no matter how little effort they give, they rarely feel urgency emotionally. But once your energy genuinely pulls back, the emotional contrast becomes visible. Now they notice your absence. Now they feel the silence where your attention once existed constantly. Now they begin realizing that your love was never something they were automatically entitled to forever. But the deeper lesson is not about making someone chase you. It is about remembering that you should never have to lose your self-respect just to keep someone emotionally interested in you, because real love does not keep you constantly guessing your value. It makes you feel chosen, respected, and emotionally secure without forcing you to beg for consistency every step of the way. One of the biggest reasons people take others for granted is because they become emotionally comfortable with constant access. When someone is always there, loving them, supporting them, replying quickly, forgiving repeatedly, and showing emotional consistency no matter what happens, that presence can slowly start feeling permanent in their mind. And once something feels permanent, appreciation often weakens, not because your value disappeared, but because familiarity made your effort feel expected instead of special. They stop noticing the emotional support you quietly provide every day. Your loyalty becomes normal to them. Your patience becomes assumed. Your emotional availability becomes something they unconsciously believe they can always return to whenever they choose. And this is how people become emotionally careless. They delay commitment. They give inconsistent effort. They treat you like an option while still expecting full emotional access to your energy, because deep down, they believe you are not going anywhere. But everything changes once that emotional access disappears. The moment your energy genuinely pulls back, the emotional contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the person who always checked in becomes silent. The emotional reassurance they quietly depended on is gone. The consistency they overlooked no longer surrounds them every day. And for the first time, they begin experiencing life without your emotional presence. That experience creates reflection, because humans often understand value through absence and contrast more than constant availability. While your love was always accessible, they became emotionally comfortable. But once your attention is no longer guaranteed, awareness begins growing naturally. Now they notice the silence, the missing emotional support, the emotional stability they once relied on without fully appreciating. Now memories replay differently in their mind. Small things that once felt ordinary suddenly carry emotional weight. Your kindness becomes more noticeable. Your patience becomes more noticeable. The emotional safety your presence created becomes easier to recognize precisely because it is no longer there the same way. This is why distance often creates more emotional clarity than emotional chasing ever could. Because chasing keeps giving people access without consequences. But absence forces them to experience the emotional reality of what life feels like without you. And many times that reality hits much harder than they expected, especially when they realize your consistency was rare, because loyalty is easy to underestimate when someone gives it freely. Emotional maturity is easy to overlook when someone remains calm during chaos. Genuine love is easy to take for granted when it feels endlessly available. But once that stability disappears, people often recognize how deeply it was affecting their emotional life. And this realization can create regret. Not because you suddenly became more valuable overnight, but because your absence finally revealed the value they stopped noticing while you were still there. This is also why protecting your energy matters so much after being treated like an option. You cannot keep teaching people that they can receive your love without appreciating your worth. Endless emotional availability at boundaries often creates imbalance instead of deeper respect. Healthy relationships require mutual value, mutual effort, mutual emotional care. And when one person continuously gives while the other continuously takes emotional access for granted, the relationship slowly becomes emotionally unhealthy. That is why stepping back becomes necessary sometimes. Not to punish someone emotionally, but to stop abandoning yourself emotionally. Because your love should never become something people assume they are entitled to, no matter how little effort they give in return. And sometimes, the moment someone finally realizes your true value is the exact moment they are forced to experience what life feels like after losing the emotional peace, consistency, and loyalty they once believed would always remain available to them. One of the hardest truths to accept after being treated like an option is that emotional reactions often do not create the understanding you hope for. When someone hurts you, ignores your value, or treats your love carelessly, your natural instinct is to explain your pain. You want them to understand what they are doing to you emotionally. So you argue, over-explain, send long messages, demand clarity, or repeatedly try to force emotional conversations, hoping they will finally wake up and realize your worth. But most of the time, constant emotional reactions create resistance instead of reflection. Because when emotions become intense, people often focus more on defending themselves than understanding your feelings deeply. Arguments become noise. Conversations turn into emotional tension, and instead of truly feeling the weight of your absence, they remain distracted by the emotional chaos happening in the moment. This is why silence often hurts more than emotional reactions ever could, because silence removes distraction. Now there are no more constant explanations, no more emotional chasing, no more reassurance that you are still emotionally waiting no matter how poorly they behave. And once that emotional access disappears, something shifts psychologically. For the first time, they are left alone with themselves, with their choices, with the emotional contrast of life, without your presence constantly surrounding them. And that contrast becomes powerful because while your energy was always available, they became emotionally comfortable. Your attention felt guaranteed, your love felt permanent. Your emotional support became something they unconsciously expected to exist no matter what. But once your silence becomes real, awareness begins growing naturally. Now they notice what is missing. The messages stop. The emotional reassurance disappears. The calmness you once brought into their life becomes absent. And in that space, memories start becoming louder. People replay conversations differently when silence replaces emotional noise. They remember your consistency, your patience, your emotional availability. The little things they once overlooked suddenly feel meaningful because they are no longer easily accessible. This is why absence creates reflection more deeply than emotional arguments often do. Arguments create defensiveness. Silence creates emotional contrast, and emotional contrast forces people to confront reality without distraction. But here is something important many people misunderstand. Silence only becomes powerful when it comes from genuine self-respect, not manipulation. If externally you are silent but internally obsessing over every move they make, your energy still remains emotionally attached. Real silence happens when you stop abandoning yourselves, emotionally trying to force someone to value you correctly. It is the moment you finally choose peace over emotional chaos. The moment you stop fighting for basic consistency. The moment you stop trying to convince someone to appreciate what they should have valued naturally from the beginning. And that internal shift changes your entire presence. You become calmer, more emotionally grounded, less reactive. Because now your emotional stability is no longer completely controlled by another person's unpredictable behavior. That energy feels different, and people notice it. Not because you are trying to punish them emotionally, but because your absence finally creates the space for them to experience what life feels like without constant access to your love, attention, and emotional support. Sometimes that realization creates regret. Sometimes it creates reflection. And sometimes it arrives too late. But regardless of their reaction, the deeper purpose of your silence is not controlling someone else emotionally. It is reclaiming your own emotional peace. Because constantly explaining your worth to someone who keeps treating you like an option only drains your spirit over time. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do after being undervalued is become silent enough for someone to finally hear the emotional emptiness left behind, once your presence is no longer there to comfort them anymore. One of the strongest forms of revenge after heartbreak is becoming so focused on your own healing that you no longer feel the need to prove anything to the person who hurt you. Because after being treated like an option, ignored, or emotionally undervalued, the natural reaction is wanting them to feel your absence immediately. You want them to notice your pain. You want them to regret their choices. You want them to suddenly realize your worth after losing access to you. And because of that, many people begin performing their healing instead of truly living it. They post for attention. They try to appear overly happy online. They force themselves into glow-up energy while secretly remaining emotionally attached underneath it all. But healing built around proving something to another person is still emotionally controlled by that person, because now your confidence depends on whether they react. Your happiness depends on whether they regret losing you. Your growth depends on whether they finally acknowledge your value. And that keeps your emotional freedom trapped in the past. Real healing works differently. Real healing becomes powerful when your focus stops being about them entirely. Not because the pain never mattered, but because you finally realize your life cannot continue revolving around someone who failed to appreciate you correctly. That realization changes everything internally. Instead of obsessing over whether they are watching you, you begin rebuilding yourself privately. You reconnect with your routines. You strengthen your emotional health. You start protecting your peace instead of constantly feeding emotional chaos through comparison, revenge fantasies, or validation-seeking behavior. And slowly, something powerful happens. Your confidence starts becoming genuine again, not performative, not forced, real, because it is no longer dependent on external reactions. You begin sleeping peacefully again, thinking more clearly again, feeling emotionally stable again. Not because heartbreak disappears instantly, but because your identity slowly stops revolving around the heartbreak itself. This is why quiet healing becomes so powerful emotionally, because true transformation rarely needs constant attention. It happens in silence, through daily discipline, through emotional boundaries, through choosing yourself repeatedly even on difficult days, through rebuilding your confidence internally instead of constantly searching for reassurance externally. And over time, your energy changes completely. The desperation disappears. The emotional chasing disappears. The need to prove your value disappears. Instead, there is calmness, emotional grounding, self-respect, and people naturally feel that difference. Because there is a major difference between someone pretending to be healed for attention and someone who has genuinely rebuilt themselves emotionally. One still seeks validation underneath the surface. The other radiates peace naturally because their happiness no longer depends on someone else's recognition. That kind of healing becomes magnetic because it feels authentic. And ironically, this is often when people who underestimated you begin noticing your transformation most strongly. Not because you tried to force their attention, but because your emotional dependence on their approval disappeared. Now your life feels fuller without constantly monitoring whether they regret losing you. Now your growth belongs to you, not to their opinion, and that is real power. Because the goal should never be becoming successful only to emotionally punish someone else. The goal is becoming emotionally whole again, becoming peaceful again, becoming so connected to your own worth that another person's inability to recognize it no longer destroys your confidence. That is the strongest comeback of all, because eventually you stop wanting revenge entirely, not because the pain was small, but because your healing becomes bigger than the pain itself. And sometimes the most powerful revenge against someone who treated you like an option is becoming so emotionally fulfilled, peaceful, and grounded that you no longer need their validation, regret, or return in order to feel valuable anymore. One of the most noticeable changes after real emotional healing is the shift in your energy. Before healing, your emotional world often revolves around another person's attention. Their messages affect your mood. Their silence creates anxiety. Their inconsistency makes you overthink constantly. And without realizing it, your emotional stability slowly becomes dependent on external validation. That dependence creates emotional exhaustion because now you are constantly searching for reassurance. You need signs they still care. You need proof you still matter. You analyze every conversation, every delay, every emotional shift, hoping to feel emotionally secure again. And the more emotionally attached you become, the more fearful you feel about losing the connection completely. That fear changes your energy. You become emotionally reactive. You chase clarity from people who keep creating confusion. You tolerate inconsistency because you are afraid of abandonment. And deep down, part of you believes your happiness depends on whether someone chooses you consistently or not. But something powerful happens the moment you genuinely reconnect with your own worth. Not fake confidence, not pretending not to care. Real emotional grounding, the kind that comes when you finally stop measuring your value through someone else's attention. The kind where you realize your peace cannot continue depending on another person's unpredictable behavior forever. That realization changes your energy immediately because now your emotional center returns to you. You stop waking up every day emotionally consumed by someone else's choices. You stop monitoring their behavior constantly. You stop needing external reassurance just to feel stable internally. And from that shift, emotional calmness begins returning naturally. This is where true confidence starts growing, not from attention, not from revenge, not from proving your worth, but from knowing your value independently of who stays or leaves your life. And people feel that difference immediately because emotionally attached energy feels anxious. It seeks validation constantly. It fears rejection. It overreacts emotionally because its sense of security feels externally controlled, but emotionally grounded energy feels calm, stable, self-respecting. It no longer begs for consistency from inconsistent people. It no longer forces connection out of fear. Instead, it values peace enough to walk away from emotional instability rather than continuously chasing it. That energy becomes powerful because it is authentic. Now your presence feels different. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop trying to convince people to value you. You stop sacrificing your dignity just to keep someone emotionally interested. And instead, you begin protecting your emotional health with maturity and self-respect. This shift often changes relationship dynamics too, because as long as someone feels they completely control your emotional attention, they rarely experience urgency emotionally. But when your energy genuinely becomes calmer and less dependent, they begin noticing the difference. Now your world no longer revolves around them completely. Now your peace exists independently of their validation. And that emotional independence creates contrast. But the most important thing is this. The goal is not making someone chase you emotionally. The goal is freeing yourself emotionally. Because once your confidence becomes grounded internally, your entire life changes. You stop accepting emotional confusion as normal. You stop settling for crumbs of attention. You stop believing you must constantly prove your worth in order to deserve consistency, loyalty, or respect. And instead, you begin standing firmly within your own value. That kind of confidence feels peaceful because it no longer depends on external approval. It comes from within. And sometimes the moment your energy changes completely is the exact moment you finally realize that the love, validation, and emotional security you kept searching for in someone else had to be rebuilt inside yourself first. One of the greatest emotional shocks for someone who treated you like an option is realizing that you eventually learned how to live peacefully without needing their attention anymore. Because when people become emotionally comfortable taking someone for granted, they often assume your love will always remain available, no matter how inconsistently they treat you. They believe you will keep waiting, keep caring, keep emotionally revolving around them forever. And as long as they believe that, they rarely feel the true consequences of their behavior. Why would they? In their mind, your emotional presence feels guaranteed. No matter how distant they become, no matter how many mixed signals they give, they still expect access to your attention, your energy, and your emotional loyalty whenever it benefits them. But eventually, something changes. You stop chasing. You stop trying to prove your worth. You stop begging for clarity from someone who continuously creates confusion. And most importantly, you stop building your emotional world around whether they choose you or not. That shift changes everything. Because now, for the first time, they begin experiencing what life feels like without constant emotional access to you. The reassurance disappears. The emotional availability disappears. The attention they once relied on quietly is no longer surrounding them every day. And that absence creates emotional contrast. Now they notice the silence. They notice your calmness. They notice that your happiness no longer seems dependent on their validation. And this realization often hurts deeply because people are usually prepared for anger, emotional reactions, or desperation after heartbreak. What they are not prepared for is peace. Peace unsettles people who expected emotional control because your peace communicates something powerful without words. You no longer need their approval to feel whole. And that realization forces reflection. Now they replay memories differently. They begin recognizing the loyalty they overlooked, the emotional stability they took for granted, the consistency they assumed would always remain available no matter how carelessly they behaved. And many times, regret begins growing quietly from there. Not because you suddenly became more valuable than before, but because your absence finally revealed the emotional value they stopped appreciating while you were still present. This is why peaceful detachment carries so much power emotionally. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not seek revenge publicly. Instead, it quietly communicates emotional growth. It shows that your identity is no longer trapped inside someone else's inability to value you properly. And that kind of growth becomes impossible to ignore because people expect heartbreak to destroy you emotionally. They expect you to remain attached forever. They expect your confidence to collapse after being treated like an option. But when you rebuild yourself peacefully instead, the entire emotional dynamic changes. Now your energy feels grounded instead of desperate, calm instead of reactive, strong instead of emotionally dependent. And that transformation creates the deepest emotional contrast of all, because nothing hurts more than realizing the person you underestimated no longer needs you emotionally the way they once did. Not because they became bitter, not because they became cold, but because they finally learned how to value themselves enough to stop accepting less than they deserve. And this is the part many people fail to understand until it is too late. When someone truly heals, they stop trying to convince others of their worth. They stop forcing protection. They stop abandoning themselves, emotionally trying to earn love from emotionally inconsistent people. Instead, they build peace within themselves. And once someone reaches that level of emotional freedom, they become very difficult to emotionally control again. Because at the end of the day, the greatest pain for someone who took you for granted is watching the person they expected to beg for love become completely capable of living peacefully, confidently, and happily without needing their attention at all.